Hey, this is Seth Parnell, the minister at the Portia Church of Christ, and this is episode 122 of the Midweek Bible Study. Hope that you are doing good. Hope everything is going your way. We appreciate you being here tonight. We hope that, like I said, I think fall's coming pretty soon, and so hope you're enjoying some of the cooler weather. It's not quite here just yet, but I know it'll be here before you know it. But we appreciate everyone being here tonight. We're going to be in Second Samuel, I believe, is where we're going to be tonight. But first, we always want to give you an invitation. If you're someone who is around the Portia area, we would love to have you. We would love to have you visit us. Right now we are located at 307 South Jackson Street in Portia, Arkansas. Right now we are meeting at 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, and 5 o'clock on Sunday night. And on Wednesday night, we are meeting at 6 o'clock. And so hope you can join us then. We've got some great classes going on. I know on Sunday morning we're studying the book of Ephesians, which is quite a good study to take a look at. If you've ever kind of examined that book, it's pretty good. It's got some good stuff in it. And so if you're in our area, I hope that you can come join us here for that. And also, if you have any questions or comments about what we study tonight, then please feel free to put those down as well. We would love to hear from you. Love to hear what you have to say. Our goal here is to be someone who kind of grows in our knowledge of the scriptures and someone who grows in our faith as well. And so hopefully we can do that tonight. We are, like I said, we're going to be in 2 Samuel chapter 5. 2 Samuel chapter 5. We're going to pull that up for us right here. 2 Samuel. Oh, I got to share this. There we go. 2 Samuel chapter 5 is where we're going to be. All right. We're going to take a look at some events that happened shortly after David was crowned king. If you know that one of the big notes about David as an individual was that he was the second king of Israel. Israel, came to Samuel at one point and they said, Samuel, you're old, you're getting on in years, and your sons, they're no good, they're worthless people. And so we need something better. We want you to anoint a king over us. And even though Samuel was hesitant, even though he didn't like this idea, one bit, God said, they have not, rejected you, but they have rejected me. Go ahead and give them a king. And even though he would warn them, about, multiple times about, what having a king would entail for them, they still said, yes, give us a king. We want to be like the nations that are around us. We want to have someone to stand at the forefront of us, to be someone who stands out there and to be kind of a symbol, to be kind of a leader in that sense. And that's what they wanted to have. And so eventually God, he gave in to that request, and Saul was made king. Saul was someone who had some ups and downs. He was someone who started out as a pretty good king. He started out as a pretty faithful guy, but he would have a steady decline as far as his faithfulness to God. And by the time we get to the latter parts of his reign, he is spending most of his energy chasing David around, all around the countryside, because he thinks David is going to take his throne. He is, he consults, with a witch who brings up, a spirit, from the dead. He takes stuff and takes stuff and spoils from a city when God told him to destroy, everything. Saul would make a lot of mistakes, and because of this, Samuel would tell him, the kingdom is going to be torn from you, and it's going to be given to another. It's going to be given to another family, and that family was going to be David. And we know David was, the son of Jesse. He was found, being a shepherd, someone who was looking out for the sheep. He's discovered, by Samuel there, and he's anointed, as king. And even though it would take, a little bit before he would realize the potential of being king, yet he started out, that way. And we know the events of, David and Goliath, where he would really come on the national scene, become a national hero, when he would slay the 9-foot giant, the giant who was threatening Israel, threatening and taunting them, and he would go out and through the power of God, and just with a sling and a stone, he would defeat that giant, which was, like I said, would skyrocket his popularity in that sense. And so David was he was always, after that, he was always on the national scene, and he would be recognized as being the next king of Israel. And so here in 1 Samuel chapter 5, we see this finally realized. And if you go back up to verses 1 and chapter 5 verses 1 through following, it tells the story of how he was anointed. And in verse 5 it says, verse 1, it says, "Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, 'Look, we are your bone and flesh. For some time, while Saul was king over us, it was you who led out Israel and brought it in. The Lord said to you, it is you who shall be shepherd of my people, Israel, you who shall be the ruler over Israel.' So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And at Jerusalem he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. And so David is anointed king of the entire kingdom at this point. He'd already been king of Hebron for a while. It says for 7 years and 6 months. But now he was anointed king over the entirety of Israel. And this was was significant. And you can imagine, whenever they have the crowning of a king, whenever they have, when someone wins an election, maybe in our day and time, if somebody wins a big election, what do? There's oftentimes a lot of celebration. There's a lot of joy. There's a lot of hooping and hollering. A lot of good things going down. And this was likely the same case. There was probably a lot of rejoicing over the fact that David was now king over Israel, because he was the one that God had appointed. But not everyone was as joyful maybe as the people who were there at Hebron. But there were some who were seeking to take advantage of this situation. And if you go down to verse 17, here we see that the Philistines were a group of people who they heard about this, and so they decided to try to take advantage of this situation as well. And so we're going to see what they do when they hear about David being crowned king. In verse 17 it says, "When the Philistines heard that David had been anointed king over Israel, all the Philistines went up in search of David. But David heard about it and went down to the stronghold. Now the Philistines had come up and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. And David inquired of the Lord, 'Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand?' The Lord said to David, 'Go up, for I certainly will give the Philistines into your hand.' And so David came to Baal Perazim, and David defeated them there. He said, 'The Lord has burst forth against my enemies before me like a bursting flood.' Therefore that place is called Baal Perazim. And the Philistines abandoned their idols there, and David and his men carried them away." And so we see here in this case, when the Philistines hear that David is crowned king, they say, "Well, we're going to go see this guy as well. We're going to, make him the shortest king that ever reigned." And so they come up against him with their army, and they're going to try to kill David, just like Saul had earlier. But David, he hears about it, and he goes to what is called the stronghold. and he kind of resides there. And David does something that's very important here. A lot of times, sometimes people are judged by the way they start out, with their reign or with their cycle. They sometimes it takes a little bit to start going. They make maybe a few mistakes at the beginning before they start kind of getting into the rhythm of what they're doing. But David, he said, when he has all of these Philistines, coming against him, the first thing that he does is he inquires of the Lord. It says that he inquired of the Lord. He said, "Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand?" Like I said, a lot of times, when a new person, like a new leader is put in place, maybe it's a business leader, maybe it's a government leader, maybe it's a royal leader, whatever type of leadership there is. Many times when a person assumes a new type of leadership, the first thing they want to do is to kind of prove themselves, to kind of prove why they were meant for this position, why they were meant for this job, to prove their qualifications, so that maybe people will respect them, so that people will look up to them in that regard. In this case, David could have said, I'm the king of Israel. I'm going to go out and I'm going to crush these Philistines because I'm so strong. But David didn't do that. That's not the approach that he took. But instead, he inquired of God, and he said, "Shall I go up against them? Will you give them into my hand?" And God said, "Go, for I will certainly give them into your hand." See, James talks about this fact, and he says, if you humble yourself before God, he will lift you up, that he will exalt you if you are someone who comes to him humbly. David was exalted because he humbled himself before God, and because he inquired of God before he went out. How big of an example is that for us when we face difficult situations, when we find ourselves in with a new role or with a new position ourselves. How can we learn from that example? If we humble ourselves before God, God will exalt us. But if we're someone who exalts ourselves, what does the scripture say? It says that we will be, brought down, or we will be, debased. As we always say, it's a lot easier to be humble than it is to be humbled, because being humbled can oftentimes be a very unpleasant experience. And we don't want to do that, even though sometimes it's necessary for us. Whether we realize it or not, sometimes we may get a little bit, too focused in on ourselves, and sometimes we need to be humbled, even if it's just a little bit, and so we may realize when that happens. But David, he inquired of God, and he humbled himself before God, and that was a big reason for his success in this instance. And he didn't want to. He didn't fall into that trap of trying to prove how big and strong he was, or to prove how good of a leader he was. His first step was to go to God and inquire of God, and that's what we need to do as well. We need to be someone who prays to God, who looks to God, someone who has that, in our mind, who has that in our approach, in our perspective, so that we don't fall into a trap that so many have fallen into in the past. And we're not someone who lets our pride, bring us down. But he says, and so David, he went and he defeated them there. The Lord gave him victory. And it says in verse 20, it says, so David came to Baal Perazim, and David defeated them there. And he said, the Lord has burst forth against my enemies before me like a bursting flood. Therefore that place is called Baal Perazim. The Philistines abandoned their idols there, and David and his men carried them away. And so he says, The Lord has burst forth, against my enemies like a bursting flood. He says it's like kind of like a flood. When maybe a dam breaks, and the flood waters, kind of rush down. That's his imagery of what it's like, to be, of God, coming down, on his enemies. And so that's what he called, that place. The name Baal Perazim means, God, bursting forth, God, bringing forth. And so he named that, he gave that, that designation because of what God, did for him. And so God, he gave him the victory, in this case. And, David, describes, the victory of God. And God is someone who is victorious. We sing that song, Victory in Jesus. That's a very accurate, song to sing. But even greater than that, it said this passage shows us that God showed his superiority over the idols of the Philistines. In verse 21 here, it says that the Philistines abandoned their idols there, and David and his men carried them away. They had their own idols. They had their own things that they looked up to and that they prayed to, and they thought that those things gave them power, gave them strength. But God showed that they were nothing compared to what he does and compared to who he is. And the Philistines had to run away. They abandoned their idols. Their idols may have been made of silver or gold or anything like that, but they abandoned them because they were getting beat. And it said that David and his men carried them away. And so it was, God showed that he was superior in that case. But in this case, the Philistines didn't learn their lesson the first time, because if you go down to verse 22, it says, once again, the Philistines came up and were spread out in the valley of Rephaim. And when David inquired of the Lord, he said, you shall not go up. Go around to their rear and come up upon them opposite the balsam trees. And when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the trees, then be on the alert, for when the Lord has gone out before you to strike down the army of the Philistines. David did just as the Lord had commanded him, and he struck down the Philistines from Geba all the way to Gezer. The second time the Philistines come up, they thought, well, maybe the first time the Israelites just got lucky. Maybe they were just fortunate the first time. So they come up against them again. And again, David inquires of the Lord. He says, shall we go up or should we refrain? And this time God says, you shall not go up. It's interesting, I find it that David, didn't just assume that God was going to give the same answer that he did last time, but he asked him again. And this time God gave him a different answer. He said, you shall not go up, but go around and come at them, from the back. And so that's what David does. He goes around and he comes at them, from the back, and he is given victory, in this case. And it says that he struck them down all the way from Geba and all the way to Gezer. And this was something that, like I said, wasn't done, based on his own, power and such. But there's an interesting, description of this where he says here in verse, it's in verse 23. He said, you shall not go up, but go around to the rear and come up on the opposite of the balsam trees. And in verse 24, he says, when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, then be on the alert, for the Lord has gone out before you to strike down the army of the Philistines. And so God, he signaled David and his men to strike by using making a sound of marching, going ahead in the tops of the trees, which is it's pretty interesting. But he says, this, when you hear the sound, when you hear this going on, be ready to go, because I have gone out before you to strike down the army of the Philistines. And the result of this was the same as the last time. The Philistines were defeated, and David was going to reign as king over Israel for another 40 years, which is pretty remarkable when you think about his reign. There were other kings who reigned longer. Manasseh reigned for 55 years. We have a couple of kings who didn't last a week. They had very short reigns, but a 40-year reign is a pretty long reign for a king. And David was able to enjoy that, even though he would have a lot of turmoil during his life. He would have the incident with Absalom, in which Absalom would try to steal his kingdom away. He would have some rough patches to get over. But being in power for 40 years, you imagine that would happen quite a bit, and it did to David in this case. But he was always someone who looked to God and looked to him as his protector, as his shield, as his savior. You read some of the Psalms that David wrote. How does he describe God in there? He describes him as a shield, as a shepherd, as someone who looks after him, as a guide, as a deliverer. That's how David saw God. And even though, like I said, David made a lot of mistakes during his life, he always looked to God for deliverance. He never failed. He never was someone who looked to idols and such, to find deliverance in. That was never David's issue, even though he had a lot of other problems that he had to work through. But yet, he always looked to God, for deliverance, and that served him well, throughout his life. And eventually, he became known as someone who was a man after God's own heart, which is one of the best, one of the best, kind of descriptions of a person that I think you could get, in the Bible. And that's what David had. He was a very passionate, person, and he was able to lead Israel to victory, in this case. And God was someone who played a part in it. He, just as he did for Joshua, just as he did for Moses, just as he did for Hezekiah, God played a role in the victory, in this case. God is someone who provides, victory. The only way in which we can have, victory, over Satan, have victory, over sin, is through the power that God provides, through the power that His Son gave us when He went to the cross and died, for our sins. He provides us salvation in that case. He provides us a future of being in the glory of God. And that's something that we can all look forward to in that case. It'd be what a wonderful day it will be when we're able to see the glory of God and be able to be there with our brothers and sisters in Christ. That's going to be a good day. But there's a lot that we can learn from David. I think that we can learn from this kind of short little story about what happened. Sometimes we have to be on guard. We have to be diligent, because when we think that we've won, when we think we are on a great success, sometimes that's when Satan strikes at us. And just like as soon as David was crowned king, the Philistines came to strike at him. Sometimes Satan uses that same thing. And so we have to be aware. We have to be diligent to be on guard, so that we don't go from being on top to being on bottom in just a few moments, because that can happen if we're not careful, and that can happen if we are not on guard, if we're not diligent in that walk, in that narrow walk that we do. But I hope this is something that has kind of helped us here tonight. I encourage you to read all of chapter 5. It's not that long. It's only, verses 1 down to verse 25. There's only 25 verses in this case, and it kind of details some of the history as 2 Samuel does, and talking about the king and how David became king, and how all the happenings that went about it. But it's definitely something that I think is interesting, something that would be good to read, because when you see how God takes care of David, it's comforting for us to know that He can take care of us, as well. But I think that's going to be all for us tonight. Like I said, this is a shorter episode, but we will have Next week we will be joined by Brock Kendall. He's going to join us, and so we'll have a longer episode next week, and it'll be more of the traditional length of our episodes. But and we've got some others that are in the works, and so I think we're going to have some good episodes coming up here in the future. It's good to have the Dunlaps here. Hope that you guys are doing well, and hope you had a wonderful day today. Hope it was nice and easy, and pretty pleasant for you guys. But until next time, until next week, we hope that, like I said, we hope you have a wonderful day, and we hope that as you go throughout your daily life, we hope that you can be the light of the world, and we hope that you can glorify God in everything that you do. And we hope to see you here next time. Have a wonderful night.